Boldwood presents Love Blooms at Mermaids Point, written by Sarah Bennett and read by Annabel Inge. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. One step at a time, darling. Ivy Fisher touched her fingers to the pretty cameo brooch pinned to the collar of her bottle green velvet jacket as her mother's words came back to her. They'd planned today down to the last detail, Jen Fisher determined to shoulder as much of the burden of her own funeral as possible in the final weeks of her life. She'd chosen everything from the simple wicker coffin to the flowers, and even the reading she wanted. It had been almost unbearable for Ivy at first, until she'd realised her mother's motivation had come from a place of love, as well as a need to control something, anything, while her body failed her more with every passing day. Ivy had been grateful for it in the immediate aftermath, once Jen slipped away into her final long sleep. There'd been no demands on Ivy to make decisions, because everything had already been settled. The undertaker was able to take control and leave her largely in peace, while he notified the florist and liaised with Reverend Steele about a suitable date for the funeral. She patted the brooch again. It was another one of her mother's choices, and managed a wan smile towards her reflection before turning away. One of the things she'd promised her mum was that she would wear a piece from Jen's extensive jewellery collection every day and smile when she put it on. The doorbell rang. What now? Ivy closed her eyes for a second as she drew in a deep breath and braced herself for yet another well-wisher. The fridge and freezer were already stuffed full of meals friends of her mother's had dropped around, as though Ivy were a child incapable of taking care of herself. It had all been meant with kindness, so she'd set aside the mild aggravation and accepted everything with grateful thanks. As she descended the narrow stairs of the little cottage, the competing scents of a dozen or more different bouquets hit her like a sickly sweet cloud. She'd run out of vases, even the borrowed ones that Sylvia Morgan had dropped round, and the last couple of bunches she'd received rested inelegantly in a plastic bucket next to the little hall table. Condolence cards covered every surface and dangled, perhaps inappropriately, from a wall hanger her mum had usually used for Christmas cards. It was that, or leave them stacked on the mantelpiece, which felt disrespectful. Taking one more deep breath, Ivy fixed a smile she didn't feel to her lips and pulled open the front door. Oh! She froze in surprise at the sight of the man on her doorstep, as much as from the frigid blast of the cold January wind. Hello yourself, Alex Nelson said with a smile. He looked almost unrecognisable in a smart pinstriped suit, complete with a waistcoat and a dark woolen overcoat. Like so many others, he'd sent a card and some flowers after her mum passed. It was a thoughtful gesture given their brief acquaintance, and she'd been touched by it. He'd started growing his beard again, she noticed, although it was neat and cropped close to his skin, rather than the wild bush he'd cultivated for a while. It gave his face a sober, more serious air that was only enhanced by his formal clothing. He looked older, much more of a man than the overgrown boyishness she was familiar with. What are you doing here? Ivy raised a hand to cover her mouth, but it was too late to stop the blurted question. Alex smiled then, looking much more like himself as he extended his arms at his sides. I'm your designated shoulder for the day. My what? Another gust of freezing air chose to make itself felt at that moment, ruffling the short strands of Alex's neat brown hair and cutting through the heavy material of Ivy's ankle-length black skirt as though it were thin as silk. Get inside before you freeze to death. Not sure she liked his proprietorial tone, Ivy nevertheless found herself stepping back as Alex all but shooed her inside, then followed her into the hall. That's better, he said, as he pushed the door closed behind him. First things first, where's the kettle? Speechless, Ivy gestured behind her in the general direction of the kitchen. She watched in silence as Alex shrugged out of his winter coat and hung it on the hook beside the black cape and matching cloche hat she'd put there, ready for the short walk to the village church. She'd told the undertaker she didn't need a car. Her mum had left the cottage they'd shared all of Ivy's life with a smile, and that was how she wanted to think of her, not cold and silent in the back of a hearse. Laurie and Jake were due in a bit to walk with her up the hill, but everyone else was going directly to the church. Thinking of them, she automatically checked her watch, even though she could feel every slow minute counting down in her heart. "There's plenty of time," Alex assured her in a gentle voice. "You can leave everything to me." "What are you doing here?" She couldn't help asking again. He shrugged. "I felt so bloody bad when Tom broke the news about your mum the other week. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you having to face today on your own, so I decided to do something about it. I know you've got Laurie and everyone else, but they all knew your mum and will be struggling with their own feelings today. I don't have that same connection to her, that same sense of loss." He frowned as his words trailed off, the first sign of uncertainty he'd shown since she opened the door. "I should have asked you, shouldn't I, rather than just pitching up here. I'm sorry." He'd come all the way from London just to stand by her side. A hot rush of tears burned behind her eyes, and she raised a hand to fan her face, trying to chase them away. Alex's expression shifted from doubtful to pained. "Oh, bloody hell. Now I've made you cry, which was the last thing I wanted. I'm sorry, I've totally screwed this up. I'll go." He'd already unhooked his coat before Ivy managed to gather herself enough to reach for his arm. "Stay." It came out a croak around the lump in her throat, but it was enough to stop him. White-faced, Alex stared down at her. "Are you sure?" She gulped, swallowed, then nodded. "Yes." Colour flooded back into his face together with a look of relief. "Okay, let's start again." He opened his arms. "I'm so sorry about your mum, and I want to do everything I can to help you through today." Without a moment's hesitation, Ivy stepped into his offered embrace, her hands rising to grip the lapels of his suit jacket as she rested her cheek over the strong, steady beat of his heart. Tension drained from her, like water from an overfilled bath when the plug was pulled out just in time. Alex closed his arms around her, cradling her close, but there was a gentleness in his hold that told her he'd let her go at the slightest indication. She closed her eyes, feeling at peace for the first time in days. No, it was more like months, if not years. Since her father had walked away when she'd been barely a teen, Ivy hadn't felt able to lean on anyone like this, wanting only to be strong for her mum. "Thank you." There was a fleeting brush of his lips against the hair that she'd tried to tame into something less flamboyant than her usual cap of riotous red curls, before his arms dropped away. "Fancy a cuppa?" Still gripping the front of his jacket, Ivy tipped her face up and met his hazel eyes. As intimate as it was to be standing so close to this man who was still more of a stranger than a friend, there was nothing in his gaze beyond a tender concern. "That sounds good." Willing her fingers to unclench, she took a step back before reaching out to try and brush the wrinkles she'd made in the fabric of his jacket. "Oh, I'm sorry." "Leave it, it's fine." Alex clasped her hands between his own, forcing her to stop. "You don't need to apologize for anything, not today. I'm braced and ready for whatever the day brings. Tears, snot, makeup smears, the lot." A flash of white teeth in the darkness of his beard had her own lips tugging up at the corners. "Snot," she laughed. "Are you sure?" Releasing her hands, he raised a finger and tapped the tip of her nose. How bad can it be, coming from something so small? He reached into both of his trouser pockets and pulled out a pair of neatly folded white handkerchiefs. "I've got a spare one in the inside pocket of my coat, too. I'm fully snot-proofed." She shook her head at his antics, amazed at the lightness he'd managed to conjure in her heart on this, the heaviest of days. Idiot. So harsh. He gave her a look that was all sad puppy-dog eyes as he tucked the handkerchiefs away once more, and she couldn't stifle another laugh. His expression flashed back to a cheeky grin. "Right, let's get that cup of tea sorted, shall we?" Still a little shell-shocked, Ivy found herself perched on a stool at the little breakfast bar Andrew Morgan had installed for them the summer after her father had moved out. He'd just shown up one day, toolbox in hand, and told her mum he was there to sort out whatever jobs needed doing. Married to Sylvia, her mother's best friend, he'd known both her parents all his life and had been friends with her father, Kevin, since their school days. Nothing had ever been said, well, not in Ivy's presence at any rate, but both Andrew and Sylvia had made it clear where their loyalties lay and had stepped in where they felt they were needed. Alex moved around the kitchen with that same sense of self-assurance she always got from him, though this was a much muted version of the man who'd flirted with her at their first meeting and teased her at their second over pre-Christmas drinks. He filled the kettle, then started opening and closing cupboards as he hunted out what he was looking for. 2 mugs were soon joined by a teaspoon from the cutlery drawer and the floral caddy that her mum used to store the tea bags. Had used. God, she was never going to get used to thinking of her in the past tense. She pinched the fleshy pad of her palm until the threatening rush of tears was stemmed. "Sugar?" Alex asked, his eyes thankfully still fixed on the contents of the cupboard where Ivy kept all her baking ingredients. Clearing her throat a touch, Ivy was relieved her voice sounded relatively normal when she replied, "Just a splash of milk, please." Maybe she should have been more concerned about the way he was rooting around without asking, but it was just nice to have someone taking care of her, even for a few minutes. Grateful for the momentary distraction, she held her peace and watched with a growing sense of amusement as he continued to explore even after accumulating everything he needed to make the tea. "Did you manage anything for breakfast?" It was asked without judgment, just a tone of understanding so warm Ivy wanted to wrap it around herself like a cosy quilt. "I had a couple of digestives with a cup of tea," she admitted. "Do you think you could manage a few mouthfuls of this if I make it?" Alex turned towards her, holding an instant porridge pot in his hand. "It's bitter out, and you'll be glad of the energy later." Though she wasn't the least bit hungry, Ivy knew he was right, so she nodded. "I'll try." Beaming as though she'd agreed to wolf down a full English breakfast, Alex turned his attentions back to the kettle. A couple of minutes later, he set down a steaming mug of tea, the porridge, and a little pot of runny honey. Rather than crowding onto the stool next to hers at the narrow breakfast bar, he stayed on the other side, propping his back against the wall. Ivy glanced from his expectant expression to the porridge, before taking a deep breath and reaching for the honey, and adding a small dribble to the top of the pot. Another deep breath, and she scooped out a mouthful of porridge. It was better than she'd expected, the warmth of it a balm to her tear-roughened throat, and before she knew it, she'd eaten almost half the pot. Deciding not to overdo it, Ivy pushed the pot to one side and reached instead for her tea. "All done?" Alex straightened up, and once she'd nodded her thanks, took the discarded porridge and spooned the rest into his mouth in a few swift bites. Ivy watched in disbelief as he licked the back of the spoon. "What?" he asked, all twinkling innocence. "What if I had some terrible communicable disease?" "I count myself lucky that my big brother is a very skilled doctor." He eyed her, then the spoon, with a look of mock trepidation. "You don't, do you?" She shook her head, unable to stop a giggle. "No." "Well, that's all right then." He gave her a grin full of mischief before heading to the sink to rinse out the pot and wash the spoon. Ivy glanced at the clock on the wall, all humour fleeing as the porridge in her belly seemed to congeal into a rock-hard lump. Alex turned and must have caught her expression because he followed her eyeline to the clock. "You've got time to finish your tea," he said, all calm and no nonsense once again. "I'm not sure I can drink it." Without a word, he swept away her mug and poured the contents down the sink, rinsed it and set it on the draining board. "Do you mind if I use the bathroom before we leave?" Ivy shook her head. "Of course not. There's one down here. You can use that and I'll nip upstairs." She touched the door to indicate where he could go. They'd converted the dining room to a bedroom with a small wet room area and toilet, thanks to a grant from the council, when her mum found getting up and downstairs too challenging. It still held too many memories, and Ivy hadn't entered it since Alex's brother Tom and his partner Nerissa Morgan had helped Ivy strip the bed and tidy up when her mum had moved to the hospice. It was silly to leave the room empty, especially when she was trying to run her workshop from the cramped confines of the back bedroom, but she hadn't had the wherewithal to start transferring her equipment as yet. It definitely wasn't something she needed to think about today. Leading the way back into the hall, she indicated the correct door to Alex, then paused at the foot of the stairs. "In case I forget to say so later, I'm so grateful you came today." He flashed her a quick smile. "It's no problem." Ivy didn't need to use the bathroom, but decided to bank an emergency wee just in case. She washed her hands, then spent the next few minutes fiddling around in front of the mirror. She hadn't bothered with any makeup, but one look at her ghostly pallor had her reaching for a tinted moisturiser. She washed her hands again, then rifled through the basket she kept on the counter beside the sink for some hand cream. "Everything all right?" Alex called from below. Ivy dropped the tube of hand cream back in the basket with a sigh. Her hands were fine, just as her face had been fine a few moments earlier. She'd just been looking for excuses to not go back downstairs and face what the rest of the day had in store. "1 minute." She'd barely got the words out before the bell rang, calling time on her procrastination. It would be Laurie and Jake come to walk with her to church. Ivy closed her eyes, counted to 5, and blew out a long, slow breath, ignoring the slight shakiness of her exhalation. As she stepped out onto the landing, she heard many more voices than she would have expected, and shook her head as she smiled to herself and headed down the stairs and straight into the loving arms of Sylvia Morgan. "There you are, darling. Oh, I know we said we'd meet you at the church, but honestly, we couldn't bear the thought of it, could we, Andrew?" "No, we couldn't, my love." Leaning past his wife's shoulder, Andrew bust a kiss on Ivy's temple. "How are you coping, sweetheart? Yes, it's a stupid question, Sylvia, don't give me that look. What on earth else am I supposed to say on such a bloody awful day?" Extricating herself from Sylvia's hug, Ivy met Laurie's eyes and exchanged a familiar look. Though they'd been estranged for several years, once reunited, it hadn't taken long to fall into the old patterns of their long-established friendship. Jake gave her a quick wave from just outside the front door, unable to make it into the crowded hall. Ivy waved back, then patted Andrew's broad chest over his big heart. "It's fine. I've already decided that nobody can say the wrong thing today." "Wise beyond your years and always have been." Andrew beamed down at her, before a frown creased his brow. "Now, where's your coat?" Alex stepped in, one hand braced on the open door. "Why don't you wait outside with the others and give Ivy a bit of space?" "Yes, good idea. Everybody out," Sylvia declared, shifting into mother hen mode as she shooed her daughter and husband before her. To Ivy's surprise, Alex swung the door closed on them all, enveloping the hall in a moment of blessed silence. "They'll wait," he said, when she opened her mouth to protest at his high-handed behaviour. "I told you before that my only concern today is you. I don't want you feeling rushed and then finding you've forgotten something." She thought about her friends huddled outside in the cold and knew he was right and that they would understand. "Thank you." She let Alex help her into her cloak, turning obediently when he gestured, and standing passively as he tugged and straightened the back of the garment until he was satisfied. Her gloves and hat were next. Only once she'd picked up the vintage patent leather handbag she'd found a couple of years ago when she'd been scouring eBay for bargains did he reach for his own coat and scarf. "Ready?" When she nodded, he opened the door and offered her his arm as they stepped out. No one seemed the slightest bit put out about Alex shutting the door on them, their faces all bearing smiles of affection and sympathy. It wasn't only Laurie, Jake and Laurie's parents who were waiting. Alex's brother Tom was there too. Though he'd been around for much of the time during the past difficult days, she'd never noticed the striking similarity between the brothers until they stood side by side in their matching dark suits. Ivy gave him a grateful smile as she accepted a hug from Nerissa, who completed the little group. "We left the children at home," Nerissa said as she stepped back, "but Emily wanted you to know she's thinking about you. She sent this in case you get cold in the church." Nerissa raised her arm to indicate a folded cream blanket that Ivy knew well. It had been made by the children's late mother when she'd been expecting Emily, and Ivy had managed to repair it after it had been damaged in an accident. A lump formed in Ivy's throat at the significance of the gesture from Emily. "Thank her for me, won't you?" Nerissa smiled. "You can thank her yourself. I told them they can join us at the Sailor's Rest later." Though she hadn't wanted a wake, Ivy knew people would expect it. Laurie and Sylvia had handled all the arrangements, liaising with Pete Bray, the landlord, who'd offered them the bar for as long as they needed it. "Shall we make a move?" It was Andrew who spoke, one eye on the watch at his wrist. As though they'd discussed it beforehand, and knowing the Morgans they probably had, they formed a protective cordon around Ivy. Andrew and Sylvia took the lead, with Laurie and Jake to her right, Alex to her left, and Tom and Nerissa at the rear. The only one missing from the Morgan clan was Nick, Laurie's brother. When Ivy asked about him, her best friend smiled. Him and Uncle Tony went ahead to the church to act as ushers. Because, of course, they'd thought of that too. Though her feet felt as though her shoes were made of lead, her heart was lightened by the consideration and care from the people who meant the most to her in the world. As they started along the street, doors on both sides opened, and Ivy's neighbours appeared. They waited for the little group to pass, then joined the back of it, until by the time they'd neared the end of the road, their numbers had swelled well into double figures. More people waited on the junction. Ivy sent them all a grateful smile, letting her eyes scan over the gathered faces until she locked onto the couple standing to one side. "Not today." "What the bloody hell does he think he's playing at?" Sylvia hissed, as she too spotted Ivy's father and his girlfriend Wendy. Before Ivy could lie and tell her it was okay, Sylvia was marching across the road, Andrew following swiftly on her heels. "Come on," Laurie said, tucking her arm through Ivy's so she was nestled between her and Alex. "Let them sort it out." "But what is he doing here?" Ivy muttered to her in disbelief. "Making a prize tit of himself, as per usual." The acid comment from Nerissa behind them was so out of character that neither Ivy nor Laurie could help a gasp of shocked laughter. When Ivy glanced back over her shoulder, Nerissa looked entirely unrepentant. She flashed Ivy a wicked smile, which helped as much as the rudeness of her earlier remark to relieve some of the initial shock, and Ivy found herself returning the smile with a little grin of her own. When she turned back and glanced up at Alex, thinking she should perhaps explain, he shook his head as though reading her thoughts. "Nothing and nobody else matters today. Only you. Remember?" She nodded, shoving the anger and resentment of too many years into the little mental box where she hid all the things she didn't want to think about. "Only me." Jake stepped in front, taking the space vacated by Sylvia and Andrew, and they set off once more. Ivy spared one glance across the street to where they were still talking to her father, and her eyes widened. The villagers who'd been waiting on the corner had stepped into the road, leaving a much larger gap than necessary to get past the foursome. The gesture said more than any angry words might have done, and it gave Ivy the strength she needed to walk on. Chapter 2. The service went about as well as could be expected, and, true to his word, Alex hadn't minded in the slightest when she'd sobbed into his jacket. By the time she'd allowed him to settle her at a table in the corner of the pub, she'd worked her way through 2 of his 3 handkerchiefs and a packet of tissues. Her face felt raw, her eyes bloated, but the funeral had served its purpose and drawn the worst of her choking grief out. She could breathe easily for the first time since she'd awoken, even with the horrible stuffiness of her nose. An ice bucket sat on the table with a bottle of white wine, from which she'd accepted half a glass. Laurie, Sylvia and Nerissa shared her table, while the men remained standing, forming an unconscious phalanx between them and the rest of the mourners. "Are you sure you won't eat something?" Sylvia coaxed, sliding the plate she'd filled from the buffet table towards Ivy. "I'm not hungry." When Sylvia said nothing, only inched the plate closer, Ivy gave in to the inevitable and helped herself to a mini quiche. "She's nothing if not persistent." Laurie leaned in to whisper as she helped herself to a sandwich. Besides, it'll help to soak up the wine. Ivy managed a weak smile as she eyed Laurie's almost full glass. She wasn't the only one not in much of a drinking mood. The same couldn't be said for most of the rest of the people gathered around them. There'd been a steady flow back and forth to the bar, and as the pints and glasses of wine had gone down, the volume in the room had gone up. Ivy had to admit she preferred it now to the almost embarrassed hush when she'd first entered the bar. In ones and twos, those people who hadn't spoken to her at the church had wandered over to offer their condolences or share a nice memory of her mum. There'd been no sign of her dad. Whatever Andrew and Sylvia had said to him, he hadn't shown his face at the service, nor here afterwards. And that was fine as far as Ivy was concerned. He'd made his choice to leave a long time ago. It was too late to try and get back on Ivy's good side. Not that she had a good side when it came to him. Oh, she knew she'd have to speak to him at some point. One of her mother's final requests had been for Ivy to make peace with him. Not for his sake, but for Ivy's own. Jen Fisher hadn't wanted her daughter to go on into the future, burdened with the resentment and anger she'd already carried for too many years. For now, though, he could stay stuffed down in the depths of the box in her head, along with all the other crap she didn't have the energy to deal with. "Penny for them?" Laurie nudged her shoulder gently. Ivy snorted. "They're not worth a penny." Giving herself a shake, she reached for her wine, took a sip, and winced. She'd left it too long and it was starting to go warm. Reaching out, she fished a couple of ice cubes from the bucket and dropped them into her glass. Watering it down a bit wouldn't be the worst idea. "I can get you something else if you prefer. I'm on my way to the bar." Ivy glanced up at Alex, who was clutching an empty beer bottle. "No, I'm fine, thank you. You don't have to watch over me all day, you know. I've got plenty of minders here." She cast a quick grin to her right and left at Laurie and Sylvia. "If I can just squeeze past, young man." Ivy recognised the speaker, even as Alex glanced behind him before quickly stepping to one side. Mr. Cavendish's voice might not be as strong as it had been, nor was there any hiding the stoop to his shoulders, but he still looked sprightly enough. How many Saturday mornings had she and the other children from the Point spent perched on cushions around his chair in the bookshop as he transported them to far-off lands of fantasy and adventure during story hour. Now he'd decided to sell up and retire. It would be the end of an era for so many of the local residents. "Ah, it's you, Alex. I thought I'd spotted you earlier. Down for another recce?" The fond memories Mr. Cavendish's arrival had conjured vanished in an instant, and the small sip of wine soured in her stomach. The sense of betrayal as she stared up at Alex was so strong it stole the breath from her lungs. What an idiot she was to believe all that rubbish he'd spun her earlier about coming to the Point expressly to see to her welfare today. He'd been trying to charm his way into her knickers from the moment they'd met, and probably thought a couple of clean handkerchiefs and a few pats on the arm would have her tumbling straight into bed with him, given her heightened emotional state. "Not this time, Mr. C. I'm here to offer Ivy a bit of moral support, that's all. I'll be in touch soon, though." He sent her a quick smile before turning his attention back to the older man. Reaching for her glass, Ivy took a large mouthful and forced her racing mind to slow down. Nothing in the way Alex had behaved today justified such an extreme reaction. He'd been kind and solicitous, an absolute gentleman. Watching him exchange pleasantries with Mr. Cavendish, Ivy understood the reason for her sudden suspicion of Alex, and it had nothing to do with him flirting with her a couple of times. When they'd all met up for a pre-Christmas drink, he'd picked up the estate agent's particulars for the bookshop, the ones she'd left on the table after showing them to Laurie. Buying the bookshop had been little more than a fantasy, an idea put into her head by her mum, who had been determined Ivy should get on with her life. Part of her had hoped the interest Alex had shown in the business was nothing more than a passing fancy, but from the way Mr. Cavendish had greeted him just now, it looked as though he was seriously pursuing the idea. Perhaps if she'd said something at the time, he wouldn't have even entertained the notion, but she'd been feeling too raw about her mum, so she told a white lie and said the leaflet had been on the table when they'd sat down. Alex couldn't be blamed for seeking a new business opportunity, and if he wanted to move to the Point to be closer to his brother, niece and nephew, that was entirely understandable. And yet, the lid on the box in her head where she stuffed all the bad things creaked ominously. Ivy went to place her glass on the table, almost missed, and would have spilled the contents in her lap had Laurie not reached out to steady it. "Everything all right?" her friend asked, a frown of concern etched between her brows. "What? Oh, yes, I'm fine." Ivy tried to laugh it off, but didn't like the shaky way it came out. When she glanced down, she realised it wasn't just her voice that was shaking and knew she'd reached her limit. Bracing her hands on the table, she stood. "I think I need a bit of fresh air, so I'm going for a walk on the beach." Laurie rose and let her out from behind the table. "Do you want me to come with you?" She was still frowning. Ivy shook her head. She was so close to the edge now, she feared what might spill out if she opened her mouth. Scrabbling at the pile where they'd all put their coats, she managed to extricate her cloak and swing it around her shoulders before slipping past Mr. Cavendish. She vaguely heard Alex call out to her, but she didn't dare stop, her eyes fixed on the door, her only thought now to escape. By the time she burst out onto the pavement, her breath was coming in sharp little pants, the ache in her chest making it hard to draw any deeper. She managed a quick glance over her shoulder, expecting to see Alex or Laurie on her heels, but the door remained shut. Not sure how long the reprieve would last, she turned and ran for the steps that would take her down to the beach, grateful the sun had come out enough to melt any lingering ice from the stones. Her feet hit the pebbles, slid a little before she found purchase, and then she picked up speed, heading for the thin strip of sand above the waterline where she knew she'd find a firmer footing. A lone seagull screamed overhead, and she felt the urge to join in, to expel the pain and ugliness inside in one raucous cry. Holding a hand to her lips, she kept moving, ignoring the wet flick of sand hitting the backs of her legs. She ran until her muscles felt weak, until she ran out of space, and found herself up against the fence that had been erected to keep unwary explorers away from the caves at the base of the point. Threading her fingers into the links of the fence, Ivy closed her eyes as her knees gave way, and the lid on the box in her mind flew open, drowning her in a wave of emotions. Why did her fingers hurt? It was the first coherent thought she'd been capable of forming, and it was swiftly followed by a cold, wet sensation in her legs. Blinking the last of her tears from her lashes, Ivy eased the claw-like grip she had on the fence and flexed her stiff knuckles. The rush of cold came again, and she scrambled to her feet, almost toppling over when her numb legs wouldn't work, and ended up crab-walking away from the tide which was starting to come in. Seawater had soaked into the bottom of her skirt, and the material had absorbed it like a sponge. She untangled the soggy mass from around her legs and did her best to hold it away. "There you are. I've been looking for you everywhere. Are you all right?" Clutching her ruined skirt, Ivy turned to face Alex. "I'm fine," she lied. "Go back to the pub and finish your drink." "Fine," she says, through lips almost blue with cold and a wet patch on her arse, Alex muttered as he shrugged out of his coat and hooked it around her shoulders. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." She resisted his attempt to get her moving. She would not be paraded through the streets like a pathetic waif. "I don't want anyone seeing me like this." Point taken. Keeping one arm clamped around her shoulders, Alex pulled his mobile out of his suit jacket pocket and used his thumb to access his contacts. "Jake? Yeah, I've got her. We're up at the top of the beach by the fence. Your place is closest. Can you meet us on the path?" He paused, obviously listening to Jake's reply, then spoke again. "Yeah. Cheers, mate. See you in a minute." "What the hell did you do? Call out a search party for me?" Ivy gasped, horrified at the idea of half the village scouring the streets for her. "Don't be daft," Alex replied, his voice still low and gruff. "Most people didn't even notice you leaving. Laurie said you wanted a bit of air, but when you didn't come back, we started to get worried, so we slipped out to try and find you." "I wasn't gone that long," Ivy huffed, still embarrassed that he'd been the one to find her in such a state. 3/4 of a bloody hour and a storm rolling in is more than long enough." She stiffened at the anger in his tone as much as the shock at how much time she'd lost track of. A quick glance to her right showed her the bank of ominous cloud building on the horizon. "I didn't mean to worry anyone. You needed to be on your own. Hey, I get it, okay?" Alex's voice was much softer now. "You held it together for much longer than I could have done in the same situation. Come on, let's get you up to the cottage and out of these damp things. I'm sure Laurie will have something she can lend you." As though her brain had finally caught up with the reality of her body, Ivy realised how badly she was shivering. With a nod, she allowed Alex to guide her back along the deserted beach towards the nearest set of steps. To her relief, the only people in sight were Laurie and Jake. She hadn't even thought about the rest of her things until that moment, but was relieved to see her handbag hooked over Laurie's arm. When Ivy stumbled, Jake hurried down to take her arm on the opposite side of Alex, and the pair of them all but carried her up the steps. "Oh, you poor thing," Laurie exclaimed, grabbing her in a quick, tight hug. "Are you sure you can manage it up the hill?" Ivy wasn't altogether sure that she could, but as the other alternative was trekking through the village, she forced her shoulders to straighten and nodded. "I'm okay. I just sat for too long and my legs are stiff." Laurie gave her an appraising look, but let it go. "Okay, I'll go on ahead and get a bath running." She spun on her heel and started determinedly up the steep path. Ivy couldn't hope to match her pace, but the going was easier than expected once she got the blood flowing and the lingering pins and needles in her feet passed. It might have had something to do with the fact Jake had one arm slung around her shoulders and Alex one around her waist from the opposite side. Either way, they were soon in sight of the little cottage in the grounds of the Walkers' farm. A wall of warmth hit her as Jake abandoned his post at her side, just long enough to open the door, followed swiftly by the herb and tomato scents of something rich and comforting wafting from the oven. "That smells good," Alex said, with a deep, appreciative sniff. "I made lasagna this morning," Jake said, ushering them in and securing the door behind them with a click of the key. "You're welcome to stay for supper." "Oh, I wasn't hinting or anything." Alex looked abashed. "Don't be daft," Jake retorted with a shake of his head. "I made enough to feed the 5,000. You'd be doing us a favour." Just then, Laurie bustled in. She'd swapped her navy dress for a pair of jeans and a pink striped jumper with matching cosy socks on her feet. "Come on," she said, gesturing to Ivy. "Your bath's ready. I've laid out some spare clothes on the bed in the guest room, and we've loads of toiletries in the cupboard under the sink, so you'll have everything you need tonight." It was Ivy's turn to feel nonplussed. "I'll be fine once I've warmed up a bit and my clothes have dried out. No need to go to any trouble." Jake laughed. "If you think you're getting out of here before the morning, you've got another thing coming. It was all I could do to stop Laurie swooping down on you last night and dragging you up here. Resign yourself to your fate and things will go much easier, on all of us." Though he was teasing, there was a clear hint of worry behind his smile, a look echoed on Laurie's face. "Yes, stay. I don't want you to be alone tonight." It was an odd sentiment, given Ivy had been living in the cottage on her own for the past few weeks, but she understood her friend's concern. Not at all sure she would be fit company, Ivy nevertheless relented. "That lasagna does smell good." That settled then. There was no mistaking the relief in Laurie's voice as she turned towards Alex. "You're welcome to stay too if you like. The sofa's pretty comfy, and we've plenty of spare bedding." Alex held up his hands. "Dinner will be more than fine." A loud rattle of rain struck the glass of the kitchen window like a burst of gunfire, making them all jump. Alex's expression turned doubtful. "On second thoughts?" "Well, see how the weather is later, but the offer's there." Jake opened the fridge and pulled out a couple of beers. "Let's leave the ladies to sort themselves out, and then I'll get changed and sort you out some joggers and a t-shirt." They left them to their drinks, and Ivy was grateful, if a little embarrassed, when Laurie had to help her unbutton her clothing, because her hands were shaking from the cold. "I didn't make it too hot," she said, turning to gather Ivy's discarded clothing and giving her privacy to slip into the soothing balm of the bubble-topped water. "It's perfect," Ivy said on a sigh as she laid her head back against the tub. I'm sorry for all the fuss. It's no fuss. Now you stay in here as long as you like, okay? I flipped the immersion heater on so there'll be loads of hot water if you want to top it up in a bit. Do you want a drink? Ivy rolled her neck so she could turn sleepy eyes towards her friend. She felt okay. The crying fit on the beach might not have been her finest hour, but it had released a valve on everything she'd been holding on to for far too long. She still hadn't addressed any of the things she'd been avoiding, but acknowledging their existence felt like a step in the right direction. Ivy's eyes stung from the salt of too many tears, and her throat was parched, but she felt at peace. A glass of water, please. To fight the dehydration? Laurie grinned. Something like that. Ivy managed a laugh before raising a bubble-clad arm to shield her face. How terrible do I look? You look fine. Setting the bundle of clothes on top of the toilet lid, Laurie crouched and began to rifle through a basket of tubes and bottles she'd pulled out from the cupboard. I've got some cucumber eye gel in here somewhere, she muttered, before holding up a small tube with a triumphant smile. It's an absolute miracle. I'll pop it in the fridge for a few minutes, then bring it back when I fetch your water. Thank you. Ivy watched the door to the bathroom close behind Laurie before leaning her head back once more and closing her eyes. She must have drifted off almost immediately because Laurie's gentle knock startled her. Forcing herself to sit up, she accepted the glass of cold water and took a few sips before tilting her head back so Laurie could dab some of the cool gel beneath her eyes. Oh, that's wonderful. When Laurie continued to frown, Ivy laughed. I don't look that bad, do I? Laurie made a distracted noise before shaking her head and laughing too. No, you look fine. It's just... She trailed off, that deep furrow knotting her brows once more. Never mind. Well, that wasn't going to work, and the break of several years in their friendship wasn't enough for Laurie to have forgotten she couldn't keep anything from Ivy for long. Spit it out, whatever it is. Laurie sighed. I've probably got the wrong end of the stick just now, but it sounded an awful lot like Alex was talking to Jake about buying Mr. Cavendish's bookshop. Ivy sank back into the water with a groan. No, you didn't get it wrong. Shifting from her knees to a more comfortable position, Laurie rested her arm along the top of the tub. But how on earth did he even find out it was up for sale? Ivy sank a little lower until the water covered her almost to her nose. Ivy? Huffing out a breath that formed a circle of bubbles on the surface, Ivy sat upright. I might have given him the details when we had that drink at Christmas, she muttered. What? How? I thought you were going to try and buy it yourself. Laurie's expression was a perfect mixture of confusion and exasperation. I didn't want to go into all the stuff about Mum, so I told him someone must have left the estate agent's flyer on the table before we got there. I didn't think he was seriously interested in it. Which wasn't strictly true, because Alex's eyes had glowed as if he'd found a treasure as he tucked the leaflet into his pocket. Have you even spoken to Mr. Cavendish about it? Laurie's gentle question was full of sympathy and understanding, and Ivy didn't need to do more than shake her head. Laurie sighed. Is it a done deal? Ivy blinked. What do you mean? I mean, if they haven't exchanged contracts or whatever it is when you buy a business rather than a house, then you might still be in with a chance to buy it. I don't even know if I want it. Even as the words came out of her mouth, Ivy knew the truth of it. She did want the shop. In the dark, lonely nights of the past few weeks, she spent hours mentally rearranging the interior layout, stripping out the heavy old shelves to create bright, cosy reading spots using furniture she'd reclaimed and reupholstered. She'd pictured bright beanbags and squishy cushions scattered on the floor in the children's section, and Mr. Cavendish's old rocking chair brought back to life with a coating of beeswax and lots of elbow grease. A splash of bathwater hit her face, jolting Ivy out of her musings. What was that for? She spluttered. For telling an absolute whopper of a lie, Laurie retorted as she dried her hand on the edge of a towel. Folding the towel in a neat square, she set it aside with a sigh. Look, I can understand you being hesitant at taking on something so big, especially when everything is still so raw. But have you ever considered it might be exactly what you need? Ivy blinked away the last of the bathwater from her lashes as she drew up her knees and hooked her arms around her legs. It would mean selling the cottage. Laurie rested her chin on the edge of the bath and met her gaze. I know, but it would also be a fresh start. You'll always have your memories of your mum, no matter where you are. You know that. But what if Alex has really set his heart on buying the bookshop? A tiny voice inside Ivy said it would serve him right for stealing it out from under her nose, but she quickly hushed it. She wasn't the sort of person to spite another, and besides, Alex still had no clue she was even interested in the shop, and she had no one but herself to blame for that. What if he has? The hard note in Laurie's response surprised Ivy. I thought you liked him. Laurie blew out an exasperated breath. Of course I do. He's one of the good ones, to be sure, and he and Jake get on great, which isn't something to be ignored. Jake was a lot more insular than bubbly, outgoing Laurie, and he didn't find it as easy to make friends. Ivy could understand how much it meant to Laurie that Jake was forging his own roots and connections in the village beyond his bond with her. But you are my main concern, Laurie continued. If Alex doesn't buy the bookshop, he's not going to stop visiting the Point, given how close he and Tom are. As far as I'm concerned, if he hasn't signed on the dotted line, then there's no reason that you shouldn't go for it. I don't even know if I can afford it. Ivy had a meeting lined up in a few days with their solicitor to start the ball rolling on probate for her mum's estate. There was a box file full of paperwork in the bottom of her mother's wardrobe she needed to go through with him. Mum had wanted to review it all with her, but Ivy had refused, wanting her last few weeks in the hospice to be as stress-free and relaxed as possible. I'm seeing Harry Davenport to sort everything out. I can ask him for some advice. As the only solicitor in the village, Harry was something of a jack of all trades, so he'd know the ins and outs of buying and selling a property. That's settled then. Laurie braced her hands on the side of the bath and climbed to her feet. I'll leave you in peace to finish your bath. The hot water had already done the trick, and Ivy was feeling a lot better. I won't be long. Hey, Laurie. When her friend paused at the door to glance back at her, Ivy held out a hand towards her. Don't say anything to Alex, okay? None of this is his fault, and if I don't decide to go through with it, I'd hate to be the one who put any tarnish on things for him. Laurie frowned. Even if that means you end up losing out to him because he can move quicker than you? Ivy nodded.